The flickering light of Asia, or the Assyrian nation and church. The weary Assyrians at last arrived in Hamadan. A more frightful sight could never be beheld. Men and women with their clothes torn into shreds had become literally naked. Their bare feet were swollen and bleeding. Hunger and thirst had reduced their bodies to mere skeletons. The ever-present fear had made many of them actually mad, while the uncertainty of the future put them all in a terrible despair. A people extremely affectionate by nature in the intensity of their anguish had lost all remembrance of their loved ones, who were found absent from among the living. The entire camp became a vast hospital, and there were neither physicians nor medicine to relieve the sufferings of the sick. The British had a contingent of troops in Hamadan. In fact, some of those troops had met on the road the caravan of the refugees, and had rendered to them all the assistance they could. But the British force was too small, and its resources were too limited to have saved the lives of hundreds more, who succumbed to the pangs of hunger and to the ravages of disease. Perhaps the saddest aspect of this whole awful tragedy was the sight of so many orphans whose parents had perished on the roads, as it became apparent when the census of the people was taken. These were all gathered and placed in separate quarters in Hamadan. A prominent Assyrian, writing to me on the situation, said, "I visited one of those orphanages and found 160 boys in a cellar-like place. They were all hungry and naked. The floor of their room was damp. They had some torn mats for their beds, and hardly any bed covering for their bodies. 2 weeks later, I called there again, and found the dungeon-like place empty. They were all dead." The weary Assyrians at last arrived in Hamadan. A more frightful sight could never be beheld. Men and women with their clothes torn into shreds, and had become literally naked. Their bare feet were swollen and bleeding. Hunger and thirst had reduced their bodies to mere skeletons. The ever-present fear had made many of them actually mad, while the uncertainty of the future put them all in a terrible despair. A group of the orphan Assyrian boys, hundreds of these are left without books or schools, to receive an education, courtesy near East Relief. It is a matter that deserves most serious consideration on the part of the American people, and particularly the Christian people of America, to inquire to why the Assyrian nation should be barred from water flow of the great American charity. Those who were in charge of America's most liberal contributions were surely cognizant of the fearful plight of a brave and Christian nation, and yet they have choked the generous purse of America and have not allowed its contents to save the lives of thousands of Assyrian people. I have been unable to understand why the name of the Assyrians should have been eliminated from the list of the afflicted nations of the countries of the Near East, and only casually mentioned by the custodians of the American relief funds, as if that name was confined between the signs of a parenthesis or between a pair of printing brackets. It has been incomprehensible to me why the name of a little Christian ally, the name of a small and brave nation, which risked its very existence for the same cause which led America into war, should be supplanted in the relief propaganda in America by the name of a Muslim country which in soul, spirit, and body was an ally of Turkey and an ally of Germany. It was the Persian authorities of Azerbaijan that planned the conspiracy that led to an assassination of the Assyrian patriarch. It was the Persians who were massacring the Assyrians and plundering their homes. It was the Persians who had become the bitterest enemies of America's little ally. It was the Persians who were driving the Assyrians out, persecuting them, pursuing them, exiling them, and killing them. It was the Persians who were betraying the Assyrians into the hands of the Turks and the Kurds. And yet, when it came to make an appeal to the philanthropic heart of America, in the place of the most deserving name of Assyria, or the Assyrians, there was placed most conspicuously the undeserving name of a persecuting Persia. Why, I do not know what the American people will think when they find out that even those small funds that were allowed to reach the Assyrians went to the pave of the Persian cities and improve the broken roads of the country. Many of these Assyrians were compelled to do a day's hard manual labor in sweeping and paving the streets of their enemies, in repairing their broken roads, and cleaning their cesspools, before they were allowed to have either any daily rations or 20 cents of American money with which to keep themselves and their families alive. There is absolutely no doubt, almost from the beginning of the relief work which was inaugurated in America, the Assyrians were discriminated against. But why should this discrimination be? It is for the various Christian bodies in America to find out, if they so will. It is also a mystery to me why the American charity funds should be given as a loan to the Assyrians, and in some instances a security taken for the same. Perhaps it was due to the shortness of the funds, or to a plan of using and utilizing the same funds again and again, without depending any longer upon fresh supplies from America. But the method applied to the Assyrians, to my knowledge, has never been applied anywhere else, at least during the period in which the Great War was raging. Had it not been for the philanthropic work of England in Mesopotamia, perhaps 2/3 of the remaining Assyrians who were induced to remain or to return to Persia, on a hope of eventually returning to their former homes in Urmia, are left almost destitute and suffering fearful privations. Probably out of their own funds, the American and the Roman Catholic missionaries are aiding to their own adherents, but what will the others do? And there are now possibly 15,000 Assyrians in the various cities of Persia, and at least 75% of these people did not originally belong to either one of the two missions alluded to. At any rate, the Assyrian past history of Hamadan was repeated. This ancient capital of the Parsis had for centuries concealed from human view the sleeping bodies of the Assyrians who had died and were buried there in the happy period of Christianity's triumph in Persia. Among the ancient dead are many martyrs, slain during the persecution of the Christians by the Magi authorities. Providence, however, so willed that additional glory should crown this historic scene on the glorious day of the resurrection of the saints. Thus the victims of the Magi prejudice in the 8th century and those of the Islamic bigotry of the 20th century came to sleep together under the soil of the same empire, that they might together rise in triumph and together sit in judgment to condemn those who hated them without a case. Vast indeed is the graveyard of the Assyrians in Hamadan, a group of the Assyrian orphan girls. Hundreds of these have neither books nor schools to receive an education, but sacrifices can gladly be made, and suffering more patiently endured if the objective which inspires them both can be obtained. The hope of freedom had acted like the sound of a resurrection trumpet, and called the Assyrians everywhere to form a national unity and rally around one flag. Even the guiding hand of Providence seemed to approve the plan, and open the path for the concentration of these early Christians on their own ancient soil. But Hamadan became to the Assyrians what Shechem had become to Israel of old. Only the conduct of the former was less justifiable than the revolt of the 10 tribes from Judah. And just as the fleshpots of Egypt had become a snare to the sons of Jacob during the journeying toward the land of Canaan, so also the free luxuries and the indolent life of Urmia created a craving in the heart of the Persian Assyrians for their former life of bondage. This shameful revolt was given strength by a set of parasites who had come to accumulate large wealth and own extensive properties and erect palatial homes through the funds collected under false pretenses from the American churches. And if some of these properties are ever to be recovered, or some reparation be ever and eventually made for their loss or their destruction, every square inch of these properties and every cent of that reparation should either be confiscated by the Assyrian nation in whose name such funds were selfishly collected, or else be returned to the American churches of nearly all the denominations in America. It was this element, backed up also by the allurements of the American relief funds, scanty as they were, that led to the destruction of the Assyrian national unity and to the revolt of the Persian Assyrians, and their subsequent separation formed the main body of their brethren who are now in Mesopotamia. The audacity of this element was so daring, their selfishness so all-embracing, and their folly so amazing, that they sent representatives even in peace conference in Paris, where they openly declared that they had nothing to do with the Assyrian nation, and that they simply desired to have it made possible for them to return to their former place of oppression and bondage, only to have one of the allied powers keep an army in Urmia for their protection. Thus, in spite of constant urgings of the British military authorities in Persia that all the Assyrians should go to Mesopotamia, a certain portion of the element alluded to refused to depart and has remained on the Persian soil to the present day. A Syrian refugee woman in exile by courtesy Presbyterian Board of Foreign Missions. The main body of the refugees, assisted from now on by the British troops, arrived in the camp of Bakuba, which was already prepared for their kindly reception by the British authorities of Baghdad. It would be possible for me to speak in terms of sufficient praise for the generosity and the consideration of the British government toward these Assyrian exiles, The British military authorities spared absolutely nothing to make their exiled guests as comfortable as it was possible for them to make them. No European city can claim better sanitary laws or a better sanitary system than the one by which the lives of thousands of these Assyrians were saved from certain death. Nourishing food was abundantly supplied. The sick were taken good care of in the newly made hospitals. Schools were established and boys and girls received excellent education. It was a vast city of comfortable tents divided into sections and streets and avenues, and it was chanted into sleep by the murmuring song of the majestic river below, or intoxicated by the rich fragrance of the not very distant groves of orange and lemon and pomegranate. While the Assyrians were thus temporarily quartered with all the comforts they needed, the writer, with the assistance of his colleagues, was knocking at the door of peace conference in Paris for the recognition of the just and righteous claims of the Assyrians. These claims will appear under another chapter. But at this time, when the representatives of the British delegation in Paris made a verbal and solemn promise to the writer, assuring him of the recognition of the Assyrian rights, and at a time when a British commission, as the writer was informed, had been sent to Mesopotamia in order to study the situation there and decide on the boundaries of the land which would be allotted to the little ally as a permanent home, the same evil propaganda that had disrupted the Assyrian national unity in Persia broke out in the Assyrian camp in Bakuba. There was a storm and there was a clamor. The Persian Assyrians, being led by the propagandists to believe that all Mesopotamia was a desert land, bolted and expressed a strong wish to return to Urmia. They were deliberately fed on false news and false promises, and for the same selfish reasons and purposes, even the Assyrian American Courier, a publication owned by the writer, and established for the purpose of political, educational, and spiritual uplift of the people, with its pages containing most accurate information as to the prospects of the unity of the United Assyrians and the hopelessness of their return to Urmia, in a most mysterious way, was not allowed to reach the people so that they might be enlightened for their own good and their best interest. Copies of the publication were later found torn to pieces or hidden in the rooms of the same set of parasites who attended also to all mail sent from America, and who had sold their conscience and the best interest of their nation for filthy lucre, and for the prospects of the fleshly pots of the lazy life of Urmia. And when the Persian Assyrians came to realize that they had been deceived, and that Urmia was still a blazing volcano, and that they could not possibly return there, they were doped by another pill of an equally misleading promise, to the effect that they would not be taken to America, where millions in money and the richest soil of the lands were awaiting them. Before the American consulates in Baghdad and in Persia were notified of the new immigration laws, a few thousand had managed to have their passports vised for the United States. Some were admitted through the kindness and sympathetic consideration of our Department of Labor, but many others are still roaming wildly in the various ports of Europe and Asia, not knowing what to do or whither to go. This humble book, I trust, will eventually fall into the hands of certain individuals who may see how sadly misled by some capricious mercenaries, and how great has become their responsibility for supporting a propaganda that has led to the disruption of the Assyrian unity, and has immensely added to the already swollen tide of the Assyrian nation's woe. Thank God, in the depth of my soul, I believe in the name and in the interest of God's kingdom first and last, and with all my blunders and shortcomings, of which I am more conscious than any other person can possibly be, that holy principle or that holy desire for the spiritual uplift of my people has dominated all my activities and all my efforts in behalf of the Assyrian nation. But conscious as I am of my own imperfections, I cannot help but revolt against the thought that the kingdom of God is to be judged by the size of the bundles of dead wood marked by the trademark of various sectarian names. Any missionary enterprise that does not carry with it the humble spirit of Christ, or does not confine itself within the path and in the program of the real master of the enterprise, or is unprepared to subscribe to the teachings of the Holy Spirit, as declared by the inspired apostle Paul, when he said, "And hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth, is bound to lay a great deal of hay and stubble upon the solid foundation of Christianity, instead of gold and precious stones." Thus the small minorities of the Persian Assyrians, who were led to revolt against the Assyrian unity and against the Assyrian national aspirations, are found today sunk deeper in misery, roaming in the ports of Europe and Asia, and hungry in the various cities of Persia. Driven by the pangs of starvation, the weaker ones have subscribed to the creed of Muhammad. They were able to resist until death the drawn sword of Islam, but they succumbed to and became lost in the ecclesiastical political whirlpool of the sectarian propagandists.